Welcome to MeDeMAP, Mapping Media for Future Democracies. Join us on a journey across Europe. Meet specialists and researchers from various fields, unravel the democratic functions of media, and discuss its impact on the essence of democracy. MeDeMAP.
Okay, how would you define community radio? And how did you get involved?
Well, community radio goes back a long time. It must be nearly 50 years old now. But it started, one of the first places it started was in South America, where, particularly in Bolivia, where the miners were really oppressed, and a lot of them weren't able to read and write. And with that idea of liberation theology and people coming together to talk about their problems and then to start people power like we have all over the world, they began to broadcast. And of course, radio is cheap. It's cheap for people to receive, but it's also really cheap and easy to make. So they began to broadcast without a license, and the unions, the mining unions, used that as a way to actually force employers to give them better wages. And this idea spread throughout the world. I mean, they weren't the only place doing it, but it went to Africa, to Asia, and particularly in Europe, people began to take it up. So in Italy, for example, in the 1970s, there were a huge number of radio popolare, so popular radio.
Okay.
And then in Ireland, a tiny country on the western side of Europe, a little island, there were a number of people who were working with pirate radio, because at that time we only had state radio, a public service broadcaster. So all these young people were playing their favourite music on the air. And some people who were working with, communities that were marginalised, some of them were Catholic priests, some of them were, again, union organisers. One particular man we're very fond of, Jack Byrne, was a salesman for, I can't remember what kind of company, but they began to go around their local areas saying, we could do this too. Sure, look, my son has a radio station in the attic. Why don't we put one in the garden shed? And what we'll do is we'll play a bit of music, but really what we'll do is we'll bring people in, we'll talk about why have we got a good road coming into our area? Why does the post not arrive? What can we do about people's living conditions? And then we'll be gathering a group of people together, and rather than going out and protesting on the streets, which is one way of doing things, community radio became a force for people to come together and solve small problems and bigger problems. And it became a world movement.
And what impact do you think it had?
Oh, I think it's massive. I think on a personal level, for somebody getting involved in radio, they grow and develop, they learn how to communicate, but they also learn how to work with other people, and particularly with people who are different to them. So just taking Ireland as an example, up until the 1990s, we really didn't have anybody coming to Ireland. We had no immigrants. We were a country that exported people. We had a lot of emigrants. But since the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, and then with all the war we've seen in the world since, we have a big influx of people. Plus, with climate change, people have to move, and we have a lot of what we call economic refugees. So it's really important that those people who don't have a vote, a lot of them, and who are like, maybe don't have a security of feeling that they're at home, or that they belong, or that they're safe, that they have a place to communicate with each other. So you have community stations like Near FM in Dublin that would have maybe 20 languages spoken on the air. And what they do is they don't just get the chance to come on the air for their Ukrainian programme, for example, but they actually then become part of the radio structure, and they serve on committees and on boards, and they get to know the Irish people, and they get to know the Nigerian people, and they get to, so it really does build community. I think the strongest part of community media is the word community. And community and communication come from the same things. On a world scale, it's more difficult to see, but again, it's all part of people power. And like, to go back to Latin America, the idea of conscientization, liberation theology, the idea that, people have agency, people can do things for themselves. But I might actually just ask Jude to come in here on the idea of what it does for a person, because Jude is very involved. You're very involved in our student station.
Yes, yeah. Actually, I suppose I returned to college and I started working on student radio. And what it did for me as a student was really amazing, because it brought all of the theory into practice. which was
Okay.
great.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it really made, excuse me, it really made sense then, you know, when you went back into the classroom. But what it also did was it helped me to create programs that other students might be interested in. So there was a huge community of younger students who may have been very interested in things like consent, sexually transmitted diseases, alcoholism in youth, drug use, and the safe environment surrounding that, which was really great. But it was also a fun side, so you could explore music venues and, you know, record shops and get people to get involved
Okay.
that way. But what it also did was it actually prepared an awful lot of students in the student radio to go out into the media world. So you were really ready to hit the ground running. And we've got lots of alumni in RTE, BBC, we've got them all over Europe working in media, coming from a very small hub of a community radio station in a college, which was an amazing, you know, facility to have.
Okay, so it's sounding to me like it's close to home. And of course, home can mean anything. But yet people are getting skilled.
They're getting skilled,
getting
they're
their
being
voice.
upskilled, they're getting their voice heard. And I suppose the very mention of what you get from it, AMRAC, the European Charter, have actually stated, and I'll read it for you because I think it's important. It's everything Rosemary has said. They actually said that its specific aims of community radio is to promote the right to communicate, assist the free flow of information, to encourage creative expression, which they do in the college, and to contribute to the democratic process. And it enables the development of a pluralist society. And I know, Rosemary, you were a member of
AMRAC.
yeah.
I was. This is going back years now, but I went to my first world meeting of community radio stations, and I was blown away by the energy, you know, and the colour. And this was back in the 90s, and I was quite young, and I hadn't travelled a bit, but I hadn't really met people on their own terms. And the strength of the women from Africa was amazing. And the men and women from South America, for someone coming from a very small island, it was mind-blowing. And the power of people together, you know, and how seriously people took issues, things that we take, you know, we know are serious, like climate change. These people were living with the early impact of it.
Yeah.
So I was invited to stand for election, and I think it was like late one night, and somebody said, "You'll go," and I said, "Oh, sure, I will." The next thing, I found myself on the steering committee, and there was so much work, girls. There was so much work in it, but it brought me into contact with so many different ways of communicating, so many different ways of bringing community together, and every single person involved in community radio but community media nowadays, digital media as well, their main concern is not what they're doing with the microphone or how beautiful somebody looks on the camera. Their main concern is giving people a voice. You know, there was an expression we used, and that's used everywhere now, giving a voice to the voiceless, which might sound strange, but you're saying these people are silenced. So give them the opportunity to speak for themselves. So one of the things I learned through AMRAC and through my work in community radio is not to do what we're doing here now, get the microphone and just talk and talk and talk. Your job, if you're working in community media, is to step back. You give somebody the skills, you suggest how they might do something, and then you just watch them fly. And it's their business. It's not yours. So in my personal experience of radio, of community radio, it was my business as an Irish speaker, so I speak a minority language. It was my business because my community at that time didn't have any radio station. We were the first one to start. So that was me very much invested in it. But when I left that and moved, for example, to the college I'm in, where I got to know both of you in Limerick, I was not a student. I was on staff. So my role when I saw a need for a community radio station was to get students enthusiastic about the idea, teach them how to make radio, and then stand back. And so I did. That's, you know, your job is to make yourself redundant.
Yes.
And that's really what participation can be about. Rather than getting the power, getting the job of station manager and remaining there forever.
So there's no hierarchy.
And of course, there's always power in relationships. You know, I knew how to make radio, the students didn't. But once they begin to learn, then I have to give up that power and I have to step back.
Okay.
And I think that's what's really vital, because if you don't do that in participation, all you're doing is pretending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're
yeah.
keeping that hierarchy that
Yeah,
you mentioned,
yeah,
Kathy.
yeah.
You're keeping control.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it can be very hard thing to
It can
do.
be very
when-
difficult, yeah.
I mean, you gave up recently. You spent years.
Yeah, with Crail, the Community Radio of Ireland. So in that experience, I got to see all the different workings from all the different radio stations
Okay.
all over Ireland and the problems they face, coming into an era where social media is so prevalent, but that the passion behind it, because it's really all about building a community and giving that community, as Rosemary said, a voice. So that's the really, the big benefit.
Well, it's
The
even-
social benefit is huge,
Huge.
so it's
And it's even more important now with all
more
the
important
amount of people
now.
coming into our country.
Exactly,
Yeah.
So it's really wonderful to see it, yeah.
And you've mentioned people coming into the country. It's really important that people who aren't citizens are not made to feel that they're not welcome.
Yeah.
And more than that they are actually contributing to the country.
Yeah.
And that they're contributing to the community that they live in.
Absolutely.
And it can be so easy. We see the rise of racism, we see the rise of isolation. It's so easy for somebody who maybe doesn't speak the language or only speaks with a very strong accent to come in, do the low paid work, go home to their family, hear about their children maybe being bullied in school, and to feel isolated, and particularly some cultures, the women don't find it so easy to go out. But community radio is one place where everybody feels safe, everybody feels welcome, but you don't stay just within your own community, your own language community, or your own religious community, or your own cultural space, because you're meeting men and women and children from other cultures, particularly from the Irish community. And when you work with somebody on something, especially when you're volunteering, because nobody gets paid.
No.
We should have said that.
Yes, that's a very important aspect.
We're so passionate, we forget about
the money. Forget about the money.
It's not about the money,
Nobody gets paid.
Yeah.
So you're working on an idea, some very creative ideas, for example, for programs. You get excited by it. And you say, I'll phone you later, or let's meet
for coffee,
downtown and for coffee, and we'll talk about how we're going to do this. Makes people into friends.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
And visibility then, what about visibility in terms?
that's huge, a huge area. And long before it became, trendy to talk about EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, interculturalism, which are all really important things. Community media were doing that without doing it in a patronising way or a charitable
It's almost
way.
as if it's a new thing.
It is,
now.
I'll tell you a good story. There's a small place in the south of Ireland called Youghal, you will know. And they had they still have a community radio called Community Radio Youghal, which is Cry.
Yeah.
And their motto or their signal was cry in the afternoon. So they're funny people. But they had got a free space to put their studio, but it was 2 flights of stairs up. So they couldn't have anybody in a wheelchair on air. So they were very concerned about it. So they constructed like a pipe that they could put the lead down to.
The microphone.
And on the street downstairs, they would say to somebody, we want you to do your programme. We want you to be here, but we can't bring you up to the studio. So
it's amazing, isn't it? You adapt.
You can find a way.
Find a way. So funding.
Funding is a help, Do you want
funding. No, funding is a great help, and we'd say a lot of stations get funding through Irish. The government would supply some funding for radio stations. We also have the Wheel, which you can apply for more funding, and it's really Commission Amman, which is like the community development side of it would in Ireland would support a lot of the stations, but you do have to apply for absolutely every single penny that you get. It's a complete skill, and it's a huge responsibility on stations. So you have to have somebody that's able to to really work with. There's a huge amount of paperwork involved when there's money as well. So that's a lot of. It's a lot of work to get your funding and to keep it.
For people who are on a volunteer.
When you're on a voluntary basis.
I was going to say that when we have a network or an association, a forum, Community Radio Forum of Ireland. It's called CRAIL, which is the word for to broadcast. and Jude was on it at one
Yeah.
stage, I was on it at one stage, and it's the National Association.
Yeah.
So we provide training for people in filling in
Yeah.
application forms.
Which is a big
And
deal.
so
Yeah.
very
we
good.
teach
Yeah.
people once a year. We have a festival of training,
Yeah.
and we bring 4 people from every station together, put them up in a hotel, spend 2 days working on different
Workshops,
aspects. Yeah. So form filling in application
Yeah.
forms is one workshop.
Yeah.
That's very
Complete,
valuable.
yeah. So it's all about information and, you know, access to education, and it's really promoting democracy, really, and pluralist society. You
So
know,
it's a kind of a maximum democracy, isn't it?
it
in a
is,
way?
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
democracy at, you could
At
say,
the
the
max.
lowest level, but the lowest level is the max.
Yeah,
The maximum,
yeah,
absolutely,
yeah,
Kathy, yeah.
yeah.
And I suppose what we could do now is maybe discuss what you understand, you know, democracy to be, Kathy.
Okay, well, it's the freedom to express yourself, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, to have
And
nobody
be
stop
heard.
you.
Nobody
Yeah.
stop you, to be heard, to be listened to. And that's our democratic right as citizens.
Yeah, and I think it comes to be translated into who controls things.
Yeah,
So no matter where you are, if you have more than 20 people, the way humans are, we have to have rules as to how we live with each other.
yeah.
And the bigger the group grows, the more you need to know what you're allowed to do and what you're not
The more
allowed to do.
constraints.
Yeah.
And the constraints are there should be there for a reason, so that nobody is trampled on or bullied or
Yeah,
denied food or
exactly.
denied the right to shelter.
Yeah.
But depending on the system you have, you can have the really strong bullies, you know, the
Yes.
men
Yeah.
with the guns.
Because that dynamic
force you
will always appear within
Yeah.
any group. won't
to
it?
appear in a
Absolutely.
Yeah.
schoolyard with
Yeah,
children.
yeah.
So that's why, you know, you need a system
Yeah.
that can intervene to prevent unfairness, to prevent injustice,
Yeah.
to provide for social benefit for people, to provide for a decent wage for everyone, decent housing for everyone, and those freedoms you talked about. I mean, they're so important. And some political systems don't allow for them. And democracy is quite a fragile
Yes.
Yes.
entity. And I think we need to use our media to help us protect it.
Yeah.
And, you know, years ago in the French Revolution, when the Republic first appeared in the modern world, they called the press the fourth estate. So they were the fourth area of life. And their job was to watch what governments were doing,
Yeah.
to make sure that the new republic stayed true to its principles. And by golly, we need that now.
Absolutely.
We need our media to hold our so-called democratic politicians and our democracies to
Yeah.
account. I mean, here we are in 2025, and we're looking at what's happened in Ukraine, in Palestine, all around the world, and we're looking at the damage that the big powers are causing, and particularly America, the so-called home of democracy, is so out of step with its own principles.
Yes. Yeah.
So you need
Yeah.
people to have their voice, to have their power, to say to
Exactly.
the people in government, you are not doing what you are mandated to do. And many years ago, in some places, it was a trade union. The trade unions aren't as strong as anymore.
Yeah.
In some countries, I keep coming back to Latin America, it was the priests in the church and
Yeah.
who stood up against governments that were so unfair.
Missionaries. Yeah.
Yeah, and now I think, you know, the media that we have in the world, with the 3 types, you know, the state or public service, commercial, they they can be too close to the state
Yes.
itself,
yes.
or the
Yeah.
commercial to the men and the women with money and power.
Yes,
And there
yeah.
really is a space to come back to our original piece
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
community media
Yeah.
to step in there and be a strong voice that says enough, or
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is wrong.
Yeah.
So
This
when
is
we
wrong.
talk about participation then in democracy, what do we mean for
Well,
people?
I suppose the old way was letters to the newspapers. And I suppose the internet has changed all that now in a sense. But you also had, and you still have, access to particular programs. You can join panels on television. You can ring up radio shows, but there's a constraint, and this constraints. So you're involved in that idea of gatekeeping,
Yeah.
and that follows all the way through. And with social media, it appears in a sense it's the ideal public sphere where we can all go on, we can all say what we like, but that brings its own difficulties.
Yeah.
So do you think it's dangerous having, I suppose, citizens participating
It could be.
in
But you have to
communication?
trust. But you have to
Yeah.
trust people. You
Yeah.
know. But I suppose you asked what was democracy. Like one of the essential things is that it's about the people.
Yeah.
And so you have to find ways of making sure that the people's voices are heard. So you can have representative democracy where people vote, and then the people they vote for go off and decide everything. And then you can have the likes of what we have in the world at the moment,
Yeah.
where the politicians are doing their own thing, and
Yeah.
or you can have a more participative democracy, which is slower and it's much more difficult to manage, but where you regularly consult people and where people say, I like this, I don't like that, I want change here, I'm happy here, don't change this. Very, very hard. It's more an imaginary thing in a way.
Yes.
And that's where, but it's an ideal. It's an
Yes.
ideal that we want to strive towards.
Yes.
Just because, I think it was Bertolt Brecht who said, just because it's utopia doesn't mean that we
can't-
shouldn't strive
Yeah,
to achieve it.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
So you were talking about different ways of getting involved in the media.
Yes.
And you were talking about, going on panels and stuff. So you could say that's one layer of participation that's reactive.
Yeah.
Okay, so you give feedback. The next layer then is what you said about being able to go on a panel on a TV show or be a guest on a radio show. And that's mediated participation.
Yes.
And then the layer above that is when you have the citizens or the denizens, the people can actually say, well, I want to make a programme about, you were talking about in community media, about this.
Yeah.
And then there's a layer above that that's even more powerful. And this is the one that we should all be trying to go for, where the people own and manage the station.
Yeah.
And that's when you get real direct participation. That's genuine participation at its most powerful level. We rarely get there, even in community media,
Yeah.
because somebody has to close the door at night and somebody has to pay the electricity bill.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's what you're aspiring towards. The other level of
Yeah.
is too low. And then social media has changed everything.
Yeah.
So you can have all these people who used to be on Twitter and now they're probably on X or Truth or not Mastodon, but anyway, you could be on social media. The difficulty there is if you have a company or a power that's funding and they're building the algorithms that's spreading things, how do you then counteract it?
Yeah.
And I think community media is one small voice that can start to do that, because the medium is not important for community development. Which is what community media are about. So we moved from the press, on Steckner's, to radio, and to television, and now on to digital media. So whether it's your own channel or, better again, having loads of people in the community who are all putting up their TikTok video about the poor water in the area or whatever.
But it's still at the top is the corporate system.
So what do you think journalists should be doing to create a democratic communication?
That is a very, very good question and a very big question, because journalists are under huge institutional constraints and personal constraints as well, in terms of pleasing the editor, in terms of wanting to climb up the ladder, be promoted, time constraints, resource constraints. So there's any number of constraints that they're operating before they even start.
Yeah.
Yeah, every single one of them we could talk for half an hour about. I think you found in the interviews you did with journalists, they were talking about money, promotion, the ownership.
Yeah.
As you say, pleasing the editors.
One of the big things they found was we have a lot of defamation laws in Ireland that, really are constraining how they produce material. And what they're finding is then they're called up by social media we'd say citizens are saying, how come you're not reporting on this? It's on social media, you know, particularly when it comes to something interesting about politicians or about planning laws or about anything that's really needs to be highlighted. And they have to then go and research it and get the all clear before they can actually put it into print. So the old constraints are very important. But also they have they considered it like feeding the beast, which is what one really clever editor told us it felt like, because you were continuously topping up their social media feed as well.
Yeah.
So they have to continuously add to it. So that was taking a huge amount of, creating a huge amount of strain on them. Plus the money in journalism isn't there anymore. It's not as respected as it used to be. And because of that, you've got a lot of people who are leaving to go into advertising. So, you know, you are losing really great journalists to be able to pay for their mortgage and just live a life.
And you have
at
the
the
rise
moment.
of citizen journalism as
Pure,
well.
yeah, and you also, and it's really great for citizens journalism, but we don't have fact checking, and fact checking is an enormous issue, as we know. We've seen it, you know, in the States.
And a lot of that comes down to, as you said, respect for journalism
Yeah.
and for what journalists do, and that's been eroded.
Yeah.
The idea of the fourth estate, that they keep an eye on what people are doing. I mean, one of the great things I heard about why a journalist is important is because a journalist tells people things that somebody doesn't want them to know. And so if you ask yourself, why is this journalist not being allowed to investigate a story? Follow the money. Look to the power. And I think that that's really sad. We don't get much investigative journalism anymore because you talked about having to feed the beast of the constant updates, 24 hours news, 24/7. That is exhausting. So all you can do is keep giving exciting headlines. You can't go down under the surface and investigate. Though we do have some, particularly digital natives now, who are setting themselves up as the place to go to find a bit more depth. Again, it gives a space to community media because in one way you'd say they're not important, they're not paid, nobody's telling them what to do, they choose their own stories, they have all the time in the world to do it. Exactly. They have time, they have passion, they're in their community so they can send out the message and find out what's going on and spread the message. So there is power, and sometimes power can be counteracted by in little ways. And if you have enough little ways all around, you're going to make a change. It's like the ant saying to the elephant, "Get out of the way." And the elephant steps on the ant, doesn't see or hear, and then the ant gets more ants together and they go, "Get out of the way." And when you have millions of ants, they're like, "Get out of the way." And that's how you're going to get a bit of power through people participation in the media. I think.
Yeah. So community radio really is a very positive, let's come together, give a voice to the voiceless, and encourage information and education.
You said it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And democracy. Thank you.
Thank you.